Welcome to the first lecture on contracts and incentives. In this lecture, let's just get started from where we left off in the last lectures with the idea of information asymmetry. So within the firm, we have some information asymmetry, and outside the firm, we have information asymmetry as well. So the idea is the closer you get to what's actually happening on the ground, the more information you're going to have about that thing happening on the ground. It's a matter of direct experience that we're talking about. There are ways to have middlemen, ways to get information out and report it through secondary sources, but primary sources are where the primary knowledge gaining happens. And so if you have information gaining happens, so if you have information that's asymmetrically distributed, it's probably because of an asymmetric distribution of experience, of primary experience with something, direct experience with that thing. Outside the firm, we have the financiers of banks and shareholders, and they have a financial interest in the firm, but they are not as directly involved. The bank is not working on the floor. They don't go visit typically, or they're not there often. If they do have some rep that comes to visit you, shareholders, many of them won't even do anything when there are proxy calls and attempts to get people to vote for the board of directors. So that they're much more at arm's length than anything else, so that they don't have much direct involvement in the firm, especially on the ground level of where all the action is happening in the firm, where all the value is being created as the firm provides something to its customers. Now, what that means is then there's the ability for the firm, at least theoretically, to deceive the financiers. So information asymmetry leads to opportunity to deceive, and that's economic deadweight in many ways. It leaves the opportunity for the one who has more information to collect rent for that information, more or less. That's the term that's often used, or a term that's used in economics with regard to this. So you take this information, you collect rent off of it. Rent. This means that, for example, if I'm a company, I'm not doing so well, but I'm going to benefit from in terms of my debt covenants with my bank, or in terms of the share price, which is important because I hold some of my own shares, for example, and it'll affect going forward my future in terms of being able to raise additional funds through the stock market and a number of other reasons. I'm worried about the share price. I don't disclose very important bad news, for example. I choose not to do that because I have that information. The shareholders don't on their own have that information. So that information asymmetry allows me to manage the share price through what information through not disclosing that information. All right. Inside the firm, the information asymmetry works in a very similar way. The idea is that as you get closer and closer to the bottom of the firm, you are going to have more and more direct information about how the sausage is made, if you will, and some of the knowledge is going to be things that will surprise people higher up. In fact, there are dozens of countries that have either a version of this show in their own country, or they play the American version of the show, Undercover Boss. It's a very widely syndicated show around the world. They're still making some episodes of it, at least. The reason why the show is so easy to translate to many different languages, many different cultures, and so widely popular where it is shown, or where it was shown, is because it has a natural drama associated with it. We have the person at the top of the hierarchy in the firm, who has therefore the least information about the ground level goings on in the firm, going to the ground level of the firm, and there's inevitably going to be surprise there. And then there's also the emotional component of it. The people at the ground level most likely are of less means or whatnot, and the CEO most likely is of means, and so there's often some charitable aspect to it. The information asymmetry part of it is what I want to focus on. That drama right there comes from the fact that, look, the CEO is one person. He or she has the cognitive capacity and the ability to deal with hours in the day of one person. There's only so much that person can know and do. The likelihood that person understands the technical readouts of XYZ machine on a factory floor in a country that he or she has barely ever been to, that they have a factory in, is very unlikely. But the person who works with that machine day in and day out does know how that readout is read, does know exactly what's going on there. I recall my first time in public accounting. I didn't spend a lot of time in public accounting, but I did have some experience there. I reported to this partner, and this partner was relatively old school, and so I was focused on how I would input things as far as the tax program would. It was asking the questions. It would want me to input certain things, and I didn't know if I was inputting them right or not because I was very new. And then I would talk to this partner about this, and he would be looking at the forms at the end of the process that the program would spit out, and because of his experience, old school experience, he would say, no, that doesn't look right, and this is no knock against him or me, this is just the nature of the situation. He was unable to really tell me where on the input side of the program I was doing it wrong. But he knew that on the output side it didn't look right. So he had this understanding at a certain level based on his experience, but he'd risen through the ranks in such a way. This is a smaller firm, so this is why I was talking directly to a partner, right? And so he had risen to partner and done all his experience more directly with the forms there. So he has a certain level of experience, a certain information, and I have a different set of information. We're trying to get those pieces to work together to get the firm working. There's also an opportunity to, again, theoretically at least, deceive. Now, I had no interest in deceiving him in terms of these tax forms, but theoretically, if I could get past, if there had been some incentive for me to deceive, and if I had known the program well enough, and gained some information that I could have asymmetrically gained at my position, then theoretically I could have got it to spit out a form that would be passable by him that would somehow benefit me. Great, congratulations to me. But that is the case in the situation with the undercover boss shows. Often there is some person who does not land very well with the boss, the CEO that comes down. Somebody gets fired or reprimanded. They're not doing their job right or whatnot. And that person probably was doing that for a long time, and the CEO never knew about it. So the shareholders are the principal in a publicly owned firm, and the shareholders elect representatives who are the board of directors, and the board of directors then choose an agent, the CEO, and the CEO then chooses agents to work beneath or with him or her, and they choose agents to work with or beneath. It's a subcontracting sort of cascade all the way down. And the idea of the incentive structure and the contract structure of the firm is to make sure that interests align as much as possible, from all the way from the lowest person in the hierarchy there of the firm, in the org chart of the firm, up to the shareholders. The shareholders, what is their interest? They want to maximize the long-term profitability of the firm. Now, I put that long-term word in there, and that might seem out of place for some of you, because you think, well, shareholders, many of them are not holding on to this stock for very long. If they're a day trader, they might be holding on to it for just a short time, a few minutes or a few hours or a day or two. If they're buy and hold people, then they might be holding on to it for at most a year. Are they really interested in the long term? What's happening 5, 10, 20 years with this company now down the road? And the answer is yes, they are, because the stock market price that they're interested in, even if they are just trading on the price and not interested in the actual ownership that comes with that stock, and the ability to choose board of directors and so on and so forth, help direct help choose the direction of the company. Even if they're just interested in the price and buying and selling as a commodity, the long-term profitability of the firm gets incorporated into the price. And so if there's good news for the firm, they make some breakthrough, some technology that they develop that probably won't be profitable for 5 years, but it has promised to be significantly profitable at 5 years from now, the price will reflect that. The price of the firm will shoot up as a result of that news for what's happening 5 years down the road. So the shareholders are very much interested in the long-term profitability of the firm. There's only so much you can do in the short term. If you really want to get to the highest value in terms of your stock price, you're really talking about multiplying that value, not just in short-term moves to improve the firm, but in some changes that stretch out into perpetuity. That's really where the shareholders' interests in terms of stock price are best met. So they are interested in long-term profitability. That's the best formula in almost all cases for improved share price and for value of that ownership stake that you have. And so they choose a board of directors, and the board of directors then is going to choose an agent who's the CEO, who they want that person to have the same motivation. They want that person to also be interested in maximizing long-term profits of the firm. And so they create a contract and the incentives in that contract to effect that, to make that reality, to effect that, EFFECT, to bring that into reality, to realize that. Let's talk about some ways in which that contract can operate. So the first thing that can happen is one of the I almost said simplest. It's not simple, but it's a direct way of getting the CEO's interests to align with the shareholders is to make the CEO a shareholder. This is one of the reasons why we have stock incentives the way we do among high-level people in the firm, is if you make a significant portion of that person's pay dependent upon the share price, then theoretically at least, then that person will be interested in maximizing that share price, which again goes back to the idea of long-term profitability. There are shortcomings of that. It doesn't work quite as cleanly because we have this whole the questions of vesting periods and the questions of the ability to share this, to sell the stock, and the disclosure of that, and so on and so forth. There are a number of different factors that kind of could change the equation a little bit from literally making the CEO into a shareholder, but it's almost tantamount to that, or it is tantamount to that. It gets very close to the idea, and in economics we call it selling the firm to the agent. So if you just make the agent into the principal, then their two interests align, then you no longer have an agency problem. Which is what this information asymmetry leads to, an agency problem, because the agent could do things that are not in the interests of the principal. Based on the information asymmetry, the agent has more information and could theoretically consume it. We'll talk about that in a second. That's why I have this episode from The Office about the surplus. This is one of the ways that an agent can consume the information asymmetry, as in terms of gain personal rewards that are not in the interests of the firm. Before we get to that, though, let's talk about another way is inside debt. So when you have a pension, when you have deferred compensation, that's called inside debt. Here, it's debt owed to the CEO or to other members of the firm by the firm, and you can't collect that debt if the firm goes out of business. So it is then in the interests of the agent who is owed the inside debt to look after the long-term perpetuity of the firm, long-term solvency at the very least, at the very minimum. And of course, there's a risk factor here as well. If I'm the CEO and I'm just barely aiming to keep my firm solvent, which seems like a very low bar, then I'm running a significant risk that say I retire and I'm looking for that pension, then next CEO maybe doesn't manage it as well as I do. There's some unforeseen event. I'm running a significant risk if I'm just barely getting the firm at solvency. So I'm going to want to put buffer in there. In fact, I'm incentivized, at least to a certain degree, there might be some diminishing returns on this, I'm incentivized to create significant buffer to minimize the risk that I have that the company will go insolvent in the future and therefore be unable to pay the inside debt that it has to me. And so that's another way in which these contracts help align the firm, the manager's interests and the firm's interest. The last way I really want to highlight are performance measures, and this is where we get into a lot of accounting information, and because the performance measures are almost always related or directly some sort of accounting information, and it's usually in the short term. And this can be good and bad. Number one, it's good in the sense that it is objective, and I want to talk about objectivity and subjectivity in the second lecture. But just as a preview, there it's objective, and that can be very beneficial, harder to game in certain ways. And so you have these performance measures. You say, if you reach such and such profits in this period, you get a bonus. If you reach such and such revenue, such and such reduced costs, such and such amount, you get certain perks or certain bonuses or certain changes to your base pay or whatever the case may be. It's subjective, and it's also highly motivating, and it's easy to accomplish in sense of actionable. It's about how much action can I take on this front. And as a CEO, you have a lot of tools at your disposal to affect the short-term revenue and costs. And if you've read the first chapter of my textbook that I put online, opencostaccounting.org, I emphasize that of those two, the CEO or management can more affect the cost side than the revenue side, more directly and more predictably. They certainly can affect the revenue side. I'm not saying they can't. I'm saying of the two, it's a phone call to change costs. Whereas you need somebody else's permission, the customer specifically, to affect revenue. All right, I think I've gone down that rabbit hole a little bit, and that's good. We've got I listed 3 different ways in which a contract could incentivize the CEO or other agents within the firm, subagents of subagents of subagents. We have equity, which is the shareholder becoming a shareholder and getting stock incentives. We have inside debt, and we have the more direct incentives based on performance measures. And let's talk a little about ways in which what happens when these interests are not aligned? Because we have this information asymmetry, and I say we can consume it, and maybe you're still stuck on that. Maybe you haven't quite conceptualized how could an agent, how could a CEO consume for his or her personal benefit the information that he or she has that the board of directors does not. And so let's talk about this episode of The Office. This is one example of it. It's going to give us an example of what's called budget ratcheting. And budget ratcheting can't occur unless there is information asymmetry. So in this episode of this is called The Surplus, there's a summary from IMDb. When Oscar finds there's a budget surplus, Michael, the boss, if you haven't watched the show, he's the boss, and above him are other bosses. So Michael has more information than his because Oscar finds a budget surplus. He now has information about their budget. Michael has the information. The person and people above him do not have the information, or would not unless Michael tells them. Okay, Michael must decide how to spend this small fortune, which I think is $3,000 to $5,000, something like that, if I remember the episode right. Oscar and Jim team up to combat Pam's effort to persuade Michael to spend the surplus on chairs and not a new copier. Okay, that's a very poorly written sentence. Oscar and Jim are on the team of chairs, and Pam is on the team of copier. That's the idea. And there are various members of the ensemble cast here line up on various sides of it, and so on and so forth. And then there's a, after Michael defeats the information asymmetry he has and tells his higher up that, hey, I have this budget surplus in my branch here. He learns that that if he does not spend that money and returns it, quote unquote, it's not really literally turning the dollars necessarily, but leaves it there so that he comes in under budget by that $3,000 to $5,000, that he receives personally. He receives a reward of I forget the amount, 10-15%, something like that. So he, as the agent, gets a reward for not spending money that he doesn't have to. In this case, his budget surplus. So he gets a bonus for coming in under budget. However much he comes in under budget, he gets this bonus of 10 to 15% or something like that, which sounds great for him. So that the drama, it comes between these two factions, and then there's a third faction. This is lining up a lot like the Battle of Five Armies in The Hobbit. We got this extra factions coming in. We have in this episode we have the chairs. We want to spend the surplus on new chairs. The other faction, we want to spend it on a copier, and the last faction, Michael's saying, wait, what if I just don't pay anything? I don't spend the money on any of your ideas, and I just consume it to myself, and I get $300 to $650 or so, whatever it is. So that's all the drama of this episode. I think that's all I want to talk about. This is an example of budget ratcheting, though. The idea that, okay, we have a surplus. We came in under budget from what we thought we would be. And we have this motivation to spend what we budgeted, because if we don't, this is the line that tells you it's budget ratcheting. If we don't spend it this period, we're going to lose it next period. That's a budget ratchet. That means that thinking precludes the idea of ever coming in under budget. You're only ever going to be at or above your budget, which means it's a ratchet. So ratcheting goes in one direction. It's a tool that has hooks on the inside of the torque mechanism that allow it to run freely, where it clicks one direction, and on the other direction it hooks in, and then you apply the torque on the nut adapter. That's a literal ratchet tool, and the budget ratcheting, so it only goes in one direction. The budget will only ever rise using that thinking. A budget can never fall. So let's say that based on improvements in your process, you really have reduced the amount that the underlying cost of doing business. You really are not going to need as much as you had before. Well, budget ratcheting would eliminate that from ever happening. You're always going to be, let's say here Michael's a really good manager, which is kind of the joke of The Office. And so let's of the show. Let's say he's a really good manager. He really has managed the team well in a way that they have produced a lot of revenue for less money, and they're being more efficient. They've cut out a lot of waste, and he's getting their interests aligned with the firm's in a way that is beneficial to both them and him and the firm. Great win-win-win all around. He's done an excellent job as manager. However you want to define that. Every month or every year, whatever the period is, he could be doing this very thing, and buying extra stuff for him, for others, for be spending it on a $3,000 pizza party. There are ways in which they can consume this, but the idea is, you literally consume it, like literally drink or buy or eat that extra money, and if he really has changed the cost function of his branch such that it will regularly come in at $3,000 under, then they could be buying chairs and copiers and gold-plated watches and fancy steak dinners every month and literally consuming it. Budget slack is the idea that either through ratcheting or through some other means of using your information asymmetry, the way you know how much the true cost is going to be for your subunit of the firm, you give yourself slack in the budget. Now, let me give you an example of how I can do this as a professor. Let's just say, for example, I know that in reality, it will take me 1 week to grade an assignment and get it back. That's how much capacity I have, given the various things I'm juggling, the different research things that I'm expected to do as a professor, different service assignments and committees that I'm on to help the university run or the college run well or the department run well. Let's say I know within all those constraints and all those factors, it will take me about 1 week to grade an assignment. Great. I can easily win points if the students don't know that it will take me 1 week by saying, "Oh no, you know what? It'll be ready in 2 weeks." See, I put slack in my budget. I set a budget, an expectation with the students. I say it'll take me 2 weeks. I know it's only going to take me 1 week, or at least that's the true time. The true cost to me is 1 week. What that means is I can now consume this in one of two ways. First, I can complete the assignment, the grading, in the time that I know it can take me of 1 week, and then I become the hero. You know what? I love you students so much. I worked night and day. I burned the midnight oil. I was a crazy person, and yeah, I completed this assignment in 1 week instead of the 2 weeks that I promised you. And then I can get all the glowing reviews and the gift baskets and everything that you send to professors when they grade your assignments early. Being facetious here, obviously you don't do that, but presumably I would be engendering some goodwill with you. Maybe you don't think I have much incentive to do that. Maybe you don't care, and you've already decided I'm going to get 5 stars at the end of the semester, whatever the case may be. I'm playing around here quite a bit. I don't take this too seriously. But the example is a good example. I could consume it by being the hero. In the budget sense, I could let's say I know that our department will spend $5,000 to do XYZ task. I put in the budget that it will cost us $7,000 to do it. I can be the hero, and we actually complete it for $5,000, and then hooray, hurrah, I came in under budget. Whereas Joey over there in the department next door, he went over budget. So who's going to get the promotion? I'm going to get the promotion. So I can use this to my advantage and come in under budget using my information asymmetry. This assumes that the superior who sees the budget, who approves the budget that I submit to him or her, doesn't know the true cost in terms of time. It assumes that you're in the position of a superior in this example to me in the class example. It seems that you don't know that it will take me 1 week to grade the assignment. Or it assumes that the superior in the case of the $5,000 for my department, they don't know that it will cost me $5,000. And so they would believe a $7,000 estimate. You would believe a 2-week estimate. And so there's the first opportunity for me to consume it. The second opportunity for me to consume it is I can just take the 2 weeks. I could take 2 weeks to grade it and say, well, you know what? I could maybe take a little trip to the coast for a week and be like, I'll just consume it with literal vacation time. I got an extra week. Or, let's be a little less cynical about this. I could consume it in terms of I can do extra work on other tasks that are before me. Do an extra research paper, or work extra on a research paper. Work extra on some sort of a service task that I have within the university, on some committee. That kind of thing. I can divert my effort so I don't do it in a week like I know I could. I spread it out to the 2 weeks. I still come in at budget. I can complete it within the 2 weeks and have extra to show for it. Why? Because I was able to put that extra slack in the budget. Now, I'm not saying that you have to do everything instantaneously or or spread yourself too thin. Remember my caveats at the beginning about describing my job and this example of me grading. I described my job and I talked about various constraints. I talked about the idea that, I really do have to balance teaching and research. At Boise State, there's been a big push on increasing the research output of faculty. This is inside baseball for you. You might not be interested, but my example depends on this idea. So I'm going to go with it. There's been a big push to increase our ranking in terms of research, to increase the output in terms of research from faculty, and there are various ways in which I'm incentivized to ensure that I'm doing that as one of the important missions that they feel, and they don't want it they're doing it gradually and incrementally, and it's not an immediate change. They don't want to make teaching suffer tremendously, but they do want that to be one of the things that we balance more and more and more. Incorporate more and more some research into your load. Likewise with service. As I spend more and more time at a university, this is true about every university a faculty member could be at. As you get more and more seniority at the university, the more and more service and committee roles you're expected to adopt, and you should be helping out more and more with the different tasks that help the university run. The university or department or the college isn't going to hire somebody to do that. It just have to be volunteer effort from the faculty, and so that ends up being a good part too. And then I even put in there the idea that there are things that go on outside there. I have a family. There are things I have to do to take care of the family. I have to sleep. I have to eat. To maintain my body. If I go into a calorie deficient coma because I didn't eat for 4 weeks, that would make it very difficult for me to teach you for the rest of the semester. And so I don't want to get too far adrift from this, but I already incorporated the idea that there are real legitimate balancing of constraints that have to be done, balancing of interests and optimizing the output given constraints. Let me say it that way. I'm not saying that budget slack is any time you're balancing two interests. That's not true. It's when I have intentionally increased an estimate of a budget, set an expectation higher than I truly think something's going to take, in the interest of unduly consuming that slack at some point. So with this paper on budget slack, in this paper, the economic case is that if there's an opportunity for budget slack, every agent is self-interested and therefore will consume all of it. That's more or less how the cold, hard economists say everyone will react. The other side of it is that we train people not to do that, not to consume other people's things unnecessarily. That's a societal training through religion and morality and ethical training. You're taught since you're very little, to share. That's not necessarily beneficial to you in the immediate, but the idea is that it's pro-social. It's socially acceptable and socially beneficial. It aligns with the larger population and their interests. This is sounding very similar. The alignment of motivations and incentives, very similar to the cascade of agents, right? So you're taught very early on. You should play along. You should be a team player. And this is inculcated and fostered in many people in many ways. I even mentioned a very similar idea in the second lecture of the signaling theory section, with the idea that when you have skin in the game, when you have this long-term interest in a repeated game, that you're going to act differently than if it's a one-off thing. You're likely to act differently. One-off thing where you're not going to see that person ever again. It changes the game. These costless signaling games that I talked about then can work if there is serious downside, real opportunity cost for lying. There is real opportunity cost for that when you have long-term skin in the game. And so in this paper, they ran an experiment, a series of experiments to test the idea of honesty in managerial reporting. So I know a number of these professors, and this is considered a seminal work in this area, but the idea is you have one prediction which says that people will consume 100% of the budget slack they're able to incorporate. Another suggestion which says if their people are perfectly honest, they'll consume none of it. Okay, so here is the table that's of interest here. You're given an actual cost draw, just kind of randomly. Yeah, it's randomly. So you're given an actual draw between $4 and $6, what it's actually going to cost you to to complete some task. Maybe it's your department. Maybe this is scaled down considerably. Maybe it's not $6, $6,000, $600,000, whatever it is. 6 million, 60 million. Your department has a certain amount that it's actually going to cost, that you, in sober thinking, would actually predict. This is the true cost, the actual cost. They just randomly assign that to people between $4 and $6. And the idea is that your supervisor will believe anything up to $6. The information asymmetry is such that they would believe any budget that you give them up to $6. And so what that means is, if you drew $6, you can give them $6 and you have no slack. There's nothing. Your true cost is at the top of what they would believe anyway. And then if you drew $4 as your actual cost, you're running a very efficient ship. Your supervisor does not know that, and you have $2 here. 0, 2, 2 here. You have $2 of slack that you can incorporate. If you report $6, you have $2 of slack available, which you can either, again, I talked about how you can consume that. You can literally consume it in terms of becoming the hero, or you can consume it by taking a vacation, if you will. And again, it doesn't have to be a literal vacation. You can use it to get other things that are of utility to you, including other work done. Perhaps you want other work to be done. I gave the example of me balancing teaching and research. Maybe I spend the 2 weeks of slack in my example doing extra research, which is still beneficial to me in my career, but it's not the teaching that I'm creating slack in this example. So here we have $2 you can consume. Now, what these triangles are the observed reports, what people actually reported. And there's almost a line right here in the middle that seems to be the case. Nobody actually put a triangle on the full line. Nobody lied as much as they could have lied. And at least one person, I think down here you have just barely somebody, maybe not actually, I think just one person right here, who drew, it looks like $4.80, said $4.80 out of an interest in honesty. The rest of them basically said, okay, well, there's a slack, and I could consume it, or I could give it back to the firm. I'll split it with them. That's basically what the average person said is, me and the firm, we'll split this slack. I deserve this piece of cake, but you know what? You deserve a piece of cake too. You can have some. So that's more or less what they observed, and they ran a number of different iterations of this, different types of experiment with this. Sometimes there's criticism in these economic experiments that, well, you're only talking about $4 or $6. People, when they're making decisions based on a few cents or a few dollars, it's very different than if they're going to make a decision based on hundreds of dollars. So they ran an experiment with a much higher payout, and the results were very similar. And so the idea here is there's this competition between my short-term reward, that's myself, and what I'm giving back to the firm. Now, these people, there was no actual firm. They walk into a room, they are meeting these experimenters perhaps for the first time and maybe for the last time as well. And at the very least, if they were to consume all of the budgetary slack, the experimenter would not punish them. It's not like, oh, we're not going to invite you back to the next experiment because you consumed it all. This is just the instinct that's been built up in them through years of socialization and years of education and hopefully some ethical education in there, with the idea that, I don't want to take it all. I don't want to take it all. I want to do something pro-social and split it. If we've got this slack, let's split it between you and me. That's actually a very consistent result in economics. The idea that, okay, if I'm going to have this long-term skin in the game, and in this case there literally wasn't, but the operating program for most of these people going into it was, oh, well, if I'm working at this company, then I'm going to have long-term skin in the game. I don't want to be fired right away. It's costly for me to go search for a new job. I like this town. I don't want to move town, so on and so forth. I want to have a good relationship with this company, and so if they're slack, I will split it with them. And that's very much what the economics finds, is people have this tendency to say, well, I want to develop strong long-term bonds because that will benefit me and you and everyone around. It's a win-win-win. So people want to do that. How effective they are at it, it varies from person to person, and they seem to have interpreted it. My read of this is that they seem to have interpreted splitting the slack as a way of saying, I'm not going to completely, take advantage of you, company. I want there to be good things for you and for me. My information asymmetry, though, means that I'm going to put myself in a position of some slack. Some of it might just be turnabout being fair play. In a sense, perhaps some of the feel that I get to consume half of this slack is the feeling that, you know what, if this were the other way around and I drew a 6 and your expectation was a 4 or less, that you wouldn't be so forgiving of me. And so therefore, when I have some slack, consuming 50% of it is actually really generous of me, because the power situation is going to be very asymmetric. This is calling back. Let me tie that in with the idea of zero-based budgeting and budget ratcheting. I said that this is at least somewhat a symptom of bad management. The fact that people feel the need to budget ratchet, the fact that their statement to themselves seems true. The statement of, if I don't use it now, I won't get it next period. Why? Why would that be the case? That would only be the case if the manager if the manager above who gets to approve the budget is not willing to hear a legitimate case for higher budgets next period or lower budgets this period or so on and so forth. Is not interested in the truth. He or she is just interested in hearing good news, in hearing, oh yeah, low costs. That's what I want. Why would that person be interested in low costs only? Because that person might be interested in short-term profits, which affect his or her bonus. And so we're talking about alignment. If that person's interests are truly aligned with shareholders, and this thing that you're budgeting for next month, which is higher, $3,000 higher than this month, next month we really need to get a copier. We didn't need it this month. We need it next month. If the interests are aligned and that copier will indeed improve long-term profitability for the firm, then the supervisor is going to say yes. So part of this consumption might simply be them saying, look, I want to give an olive leaf here, but I know that your interests aren't necessarily aligned with the firm's either. And if you need to crush me to get your bonus, you might just do that. So I'm going to consume half of this slack. That's a product of the information asymmetry that I have. Okay, the asymmetry again is about, I know the actual cost draw, you do not. You think it's going to be 6 or below, and so I can report up to $6 as my cost draw. And so therefore this triangle becomes what I can consume depending on where my cost draw lies, right here on the x-axis. All right, and so I think I want to cover one more thing. Now, one development over the last 10, 15 years, but ramps up over the last 5 or so, is this idea of CSR, corporate social responsibility. And I've done research in this area, and I'm familiar with the general societal trend as well, with the idea being that corporations, although they only have a legal responsibility to their shareholders who own them and the regulators who maintain the business environment, but aside from that, the corporate social responsibility movement or argument says that they have these unwritten societal contracts, a social contract with other stakeholders. In fact, earlier in the lecture, I said stakeholders and I had to correct myself. No, stakeholders is a separate word, which the idea being that somebody who holds some sort of social stake in the company. One of the problems with this word is it's very broad, and it's almost impossible to have a complete definition of the universe of stakeholders, and so therefore you can always have new entrants asking for their piece of the pie. You always have I think fundamentally it's a flawed idea because there's no definition of stakeholder. There's no limiting principle. Who is not going to be a stakeholder? At the end of the day, the definition of stakeholder is flexible enough that my uncle's brother's cat's sitter could be a stakeholder in my company because of some downstream effect. You could make that argument. It's not very strong, but stakeholder as a definition has no limiting principle that would preclude that argument from including that person as a stakeholder. So it's flawed, but it's the basic idea behind this social contract. And usually when people are talking about CSR, they're not talking that far distant. But I want to point out that there's a flaw in the underlying. It's an informal rule that keeps stakeholders limited to people close to the firm. It's not a formal rule. It's not part of the definition of stakeholder. It could that meaning can be stretched very widely and broadly. But anyway, you have this idea of some sort of social contract, and it's going to tell the firm to do something that's pro-social, but probably costly to the firm and contrary to long-term profitability of the firm, or maybe anyway. And you have an employment contract, which induces the firm and all its agents to maximize long-term profitability for the shareholders. And that's the reason why the shareholders put money into it or bought the stock from those people who put money into it. And so you have these two competing contracts. You have the legal contract, which is the second one I mentioned, the legal contract that you have, which is literal and finite, and so it has certain ramifications or certain defined and clear clauses in it. And you have the social contract, which is much more amorphous and flexible and also wide-reaching. And so those are the two parts of it. That said, the movement has gained a lot of strength because the emotional side of the CSR benefits that society gains from companies doing this has had a lot of publicity recently. And honestly, sometimes the two don't have a conflict. Sometimes, a firm can do something that is beneficial to society, and it will also benefit itself, in part because it generates good publicity in the current environment. And so, hey, you know what? If we give so much money to a local charity, then that will buy us some goodwill or improve our image and so on and so forth. There's a degree to which there's a question of sincerity in there. But insofar as the movement of CSR is willing to carry water for our sincerity because we're giving money to interests that benefit them, then you know what? We might have some leeway to still gain that goodwill, even if we're not terribly sincere or we're doing things that are contradictory in other directions. There's no legal requirement for CSR. It's not a formal contract. It's a social, informal contract. The idea that you owe something to the community, and community is a big key word there because that's the same idea as stakeholder. It can be stretched to very, very, very far to include the whole world, really, if we're talking about it. And maybe even aliens. Maybe the aliens are part of our stakeholders and part of our community as well. We need to worry about how what we're doing affects the aliens in outer space. But anyway, the point is, the community is a very flexible thing. So, you owe something to the community. And what that something is, we don't know, but we're going to ask for it and we're going to demand it. Maybe tipping my hand a little bit here that there's a way in which this can go wrong. And I think that it deserves a little pushback. And there's some definitional problems with this underlying this CSR push. But a lot of companies have gone down that road. They've gotten good publicity for it. They've gotten their employees on board. Now employees have more loyalty oftentimes, or more pro-social behavior within the firm. That's one of the findings, is that you have this organizational citizenship that increases. People willing to volunteer for things that they otherwise wouldn't volunteer for. People doing things that would not benefit them personally, but because it's for a good cause, they're willing to do it. Now the company has this halo effect around it, and they're going to be considered being a good cause. And my company does good things because they're involved in this charitable work, and so therefore I'm going to help them because by proxy I'm helping this charity. And so you have a number of benefits that companies are reaping. You have a number of things that companies are able to do. That doesn't give the idea of social responsibility in the corporate setting carte blanche. So let's make it so that anything that's done in that name works or is beneficial to the firm or even society in general. And so I want to make sure that's really clear. So that's a way in which we have these conflicts of contracts as well. Sometimes people are consuming. Sometimes, for example, there was one experiment that I saw. I'm not sure if it ever got published, but where a very similar thing to this experiment was done, in the sense that the manager had room to effectively lie to increase benefit to a social cause. So instead of consuming it personally, the personal benefit to the experimentee, the participant in the experiment, was good feels. They just felt like they were being pro-social. They had to feel good about themselves, like the halo of good feelings, of good affect, and people did. A good number of people in the experiment did indeed. They lied for the greater good, as it were. This goes hand in hand with this idea of contracts and information asymmetry. I want to talk a little more next time about different ways in which the incentives, in terms of the performance measures, can operate, and that gets into a lot of accounting stuff. This is why this is considered a managerial accounting topic. And that's it. Bye.